Thanks very much, Ari, and thank you all for zooming in. My book came out about a year ago, and so I feel a little bit like I've been living under a Yiddish curse, which is may your book come out during a pandemic when all the bookstores are closed. So it's nice to have events like this where I can really talk to people about the book directly and share with you some of the incredible history here. People often ask me, how did you get interested in this topic? Because the whole idea of Jews in China is not something that kind of springs to mind as a possible topic. And it all really started back in the late 1970s when I was right out of college and I was a young foreign correspondent in China. And I was in Shanghai, and as I say, it was the late 1970s, and this was back when China was still Red China. Chairman Mao had died just a few years before. There were far more bicycles than cars on the street. Everybody was wearing those blue Mao suits that we remember, kind of looking identical as they walked around and did their work. And I was in Shanghai, walking along the Bund, that famous waterfront area with the big Art Deco buildings. And I had to use the bathroom. And so I stepped into a hotel. It was like walking into a 1930s movie set. There were marble floors, beautiful chandeliers, Lalique crystal wall fixtures, and a bellhop dressed all in white came up to me. And when I asked him in English where the bathroom was, he responded to me in French. And so I left there thinking, this is an odd thing. What's this kind of slice of the 1930s glamour doing in the middle of communist China? And someone told me that this hotel had actually been built by a wealthy Jewish playboy, a man named Victor Sassoon, who had once been one of the richest men in the world, and had built this hotel. And his family had built synagogues. And the way reporters work is we often are kind of filing away these stories while we're rushing off to cover something else. And I tucked that one in the back of my mind. A few years later, I was back in Shanghai. And at that point, we were all assigned minders, basically government officials who went along with us to make sure we didn't ask any embarrassing questions and kind of, tried to make sure that we only covered things they wanted us to cover. And this fellow said to me, he wanted to show me the Children's Palace. And the Children's Palace, he explained, was a place where Chinese parents would bring their children for violin lessons on the weekend, dance lessons, that kind of thing. So I thought, sure, that could be a nice little feature story. And so I followed him. And once again, there was this incredibly incongruous scene. This Children's Palace looked like an English manor house in the middle of Shanghai, surrounded by manicured lawns. It looked like something out of Downton Abbey, not China. And I went inside, and sure enough, there were Chinese kids taking their music lessons, taking their dance lessons. But the inside of the house was magnificent. The ballroom was the size of a football field. There were sweeping staircases going up to the second floor. This had clearly been a grand house that someone lived in at one point. And as I left, I noticed a small plaque right on the entry to the house, which said this had once been the home of the Kadoorie family. Well, I knew the Kadoorie family because they were the richest Jewish family in Hong Kong, where I was living at the time. They were very prominent, very influential, very powerful. But I hadn't known that they had actually gotten their start in Shanghai, living in this magnificent mansion. A few years after that, I got posted to Beijing as the Wall Street Journal's Beijing bureau chief. And my wife and I went over. We had 3 little kids at the time, and they loved going to Shanghai. Shanghai for them was exotic, it was exciting, and they loved exploring the city. And so one weekend we went out to explore kind of a poorer part of the city. And as we walked down these alleyways past these tenements, really, I noticed that on the doorposts of many of these tenements, there were the shadows of mezuzahs, not the mezuzahs themselves, but the shadows of where they once had been. And once again, I tried to make sense of this. What were these mezuzahs doing in the middle of Shanghai? And of course, as I found out, they were the mezuzahs that had been put there by some of the 18,000 Jewish refugees who had been saved in Shanghai from the Nazis, had found refuge there. So all these kind of moments collected in my brain, and I decided at one point to find out what was going on, what was the story here. And the story took me to Baghdad. Now, we know the story, most of us come from the story of Jews in Europe, living in Jews who were born into shtetls, into ghettos, very poor often, discriminated against, and who gradually worked their way up through the 19th and 20th century to positions of prominence and wealth and academics and throughout society. But these Jews in Baghdad were different. These are Jews actually that we read about in the Bible. In the Bible, where we read about by the rivers of Babylon, where we wept when we remembered Zion, Babylon was Baghdad. And the Jews of Baghdad had been kidnapped by Nebuchadnezzar after the destruction of the temple and taken as captives to Baghdad. And it was there that they began to sort of live their life. And while they may have wept by the rivers of Babylon, in fact, the Jews in Baghdad did extraordinarily well. They were very gifted in business and in commerce. And as a result, they became a really elite class in Baghdad and had so much financial and other success that when they had the chance to return to Jerusalem, most of them decided not to go. They enjoyed the life that they had in Baghdad. They became so wealthy and influential that one family was named the head of the Jewish community, called the Prince of the Captivity. And this person was brought to meet on a regular basis with the rulers of Baghdad. Typically, they were Turks or Ottomans through the years. And whenever this head of the Jewish community was brought to meet with the Pasha, he was carried on a sedan chair through the streets, and everyone, Jew or Gentile alike, would bow their head in reverence as he passed, because he was seen as this eminent person from this eminent family. That family was the Sassoon family. The Sassoons were the most successful traders in Baghdad. They had trading networks all throughout the Middle East and the Near East, and they consulted regularly with the Baghdadi government, advising them almost like the Secretary of the Treasury. Now, as often happens in Jewish history, at a certain point in the early 1800s, things began to turn against the Jews. The rulers of Baghdad, the Turks who ruled Baghdad, began to kidnap wealthy Jews and hold them for ransom. And this is how David Sassoon, who was 37 years old at the time, was preparing to take over this family dynasty, instead found himself in prison. His father rushed down to ransom him out. But he knew that things were not going to go well for the Jews. And so he wanted to get his family to safety. And so from the jail, he gathered up his son, took him down to the waterfront, put him on a small boat, and set him sailing away from Baghdad into safety. But before he sailed away, David Sassoon's father took a cloak that he had sewn in pearls and precious gems and draped that over his son's shoulders so he would have something to start with when he started his new life. So when I look at the origins of this story, we all know the story of Fiddler on the Roof. And that's a story that, tells the story of many of our parents, grandparents, great-great-grandparents. But I think the story of the Sassoons is in many ways almost Shakespearean. It's the story of an almost royal family of incredible power and influence that lost everything and then spent the next century or two trying to get it all back. So David Sassoon leaves Baghdad, leaves his family, his wife, his children, and he washes up in India. And he arrives in India just at the time when the British colonialists are arriving in India and are about to make India a colony. So David Sassoon looks around and he decides that Britain is the future, and that he wants to become part of the British Empire. Even though he himself never learns English, he decides that he will embrace Britain however he can. He's very successful as a businessman from the very start. Even though he's on his own, he has all the Sassoon networks. He has these gems that have been sewn into his cloak, and he's able to get his family out of Baghdad to safety in India. And he begins to trade, and within a few years has become a millionaire and is considered one of the leading businessmen in India. But he also decides that all his children are going to be British. He enrolls them in British schools, he teaches them, brings in tutors to teach them English. And when Queen Victoria ascends the throne, he insists that they all stand out on the waterfront of Bombay in their Arabic robes and sing God Save the Queen to show that they're going to be loyal to Great Britain. This pays off very well for David Sassoon. He becomes very successful, and he also realizes that there's a great deal of money to be made in China and in opium. Now, China at this point was still a closed country. It didn't want anyone coming in who did not have permission. Most of its cities were closed to foreigners. And the main reason for that was that the British firms were dealing in opium and smuggling opium into China. Opium was incredibly profitable. It's a very profitable business for these British firms. But the Chinese were very afraid of it. And about this time, about 12% of China's population was addicted to opium. Now, as a comparison, these days, about 2% of Americans struggle with opioid addiction. And we know the kind of pain and suffering that opioid addiction has caused in the United States and elsewhere. Well, imagine if it was 6 times as bad. This was the situation that China was facing. And so they really wanted to keep opium out of their country. But the British companies saw enormous profits could be made. And so they lobbied the British government to essentially go to war with China over opium. These were the Opium Wars of the late 1830s and early 1840s, when British gunboats sailed up into China, defeated the Chinese Empire, and demanded that China open up its cities for trade. Hong Kong, Shanghai, Guangzhou, all the great cities of China, so the British could trade opium and eventually other products. Well, David Sassoon looked at this and he realized there was an incredible business opportunity to be made. And he had 8 sons, and he essentially deployed his 8 sons across China to establish a beachhead for the family business. And the Sassoons became very successful in trading opium, in large part because they were technologically very innovative. I sometimes think of China at this time like the Silicon Valley of its time, where young men, they were always men, could go and make a fortune very quickly. The Sassoons decided to invest in steamships. And what that meant was that they could take the opium, which was grown in India, and get it to China faster than their British rivals who were using sailing ships. They were the first family to invest in the telegraph, and that allowed all the sons of David Sassoon to communicate with each other and to communicate with their father back in Bombay and discuss what was the price of opium doing? Should they bring the ships now? Should they wait until the price rose? And because of these innovations and this kind of entrepreneurial thinking, within about 10 or 15 years, the Sassoons were able to dominate the opium trade and to drive all their British rivals out of business. When I was working on the book, I was able to see the business records of many of the British companies who were dealing with the Sassoons, Jardine Matheson and others. And they were just kind of stunned by how swiftly the Sassoons were able to take over the opium trades. They kept on referring to these dirty Jews, where were they coming from, these hook-nosed traders. But the fact was, by 1860, 1870, the Sassoons essentially controlled the opium trade to China. And the communists in 1949, when they were able to conquer China, they seized the Sassoon business records in Shanghai. And I was able to see them. And the Chinese concluded that the Sassoons probably made about $1 billion, B for billion, in profits from the opium trade. And that money then was kind of used to buy other property, build hotels, build factories, and so forth. I think the whole question of opium is a difficult one because certainly as Jews, many of us feel that the idea of Jewish values is something that's going to influence all your life and your business decisions as well. And we like to think of Jewish businessmen as being perhaps more moral than others. And so I asked the Sassoon descendants today about the opium trade and about their feelings about it. And they pointed out quite rightly, opium was legal. It had been made legal after the Opium War. It was legal in Britain. It was legal in India. In fact, the British government taxed opium to help pay for the colonial government in India. One way the Sassoons became so influential is that they would entice members of the British aristocracy, including the Prince of Wales, to invest in opium as a way for them to make a quick profit as well. And so what the Sassoons would say to me is that, opium, it was like cigarettes or like alcohol. This was a vice, and, the Chinese wanted it. And so the Sassoons saw it as a business decision. And while that's true, I don't think it tells the whole story. The Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was. They themselves never used opium. And in fact, while they were growing their opium trade, there were numerous efforts in London, the United States, and elsewhere to stop the opium trade. Doctors would mobilize to speak out against it. There would be campaigns to try to make the opium trade illegal. And when I went through the Sassoon business papers, they often are having to fire Chinese workers who had become, helpless because they were addicted to opium. So the Sassoons sort of knew what they were doing. And I think at some level, sadly, they sort of had a British or an imperial or a colonialist mindset, which is that the suffering this was causing the Chinese didn't matter as much to them as the profits did. There's a famous quote, I think it's from Balzac, who said, behind every great fortune, there's a great crime. And I think in the case of the Sassoons, that crime was opium. As I mentioned, David Sassoon had 8 sons, and he sent them across China, but he also soon realized that if they were going to succeed as a global dynasty, as a global business, they had to get a foothold in London. So he began to send his sons to London, where they were buying British manor houses. They enrolled their children in Eton. They began to have these lavish parties where they would woo members of the British aristocracy and others. And in fact, the Sassoons became very close to the Prince of Wales, Queen Victoria's son, who had a gambling habit, which the Sassoons kind of gave him money so he could gamble it away. They would go on rest cures with him to various spas around Europe, and they became quite influential both in the government and among the royal family and in Buckingham Palace. In fact, when the Prince of Wales became king in the early 1900s, Winston Churchill, who knew the Sassoons from all these parties, wrote to a friend and said, "I wonder if the king is going to bring his Jews with him to Buckingham Palace." I mean, this was a sign of both how influential the Sassoons were, but also the kind of anti-Semitism that they ran into, where the British wanted to do business with them. They wanted to eat their food and enjoy their hospitality, but there still was a kind of social anti-Semitism. In fact, when I would read many of the diaries of these British aristocrats, they would describe going to these incredible parties the Sassoons held, but then saying, "I would never let them into my house. I would never want to associate with these Jews." By the late 19th century, or by around 1900, the Sassoons were incredibly influential in England, but they were losing people. They were losing sort of the talent that needed to run the company in India. Most of the sons had moved to England at this point, and one of the remaining ones in Bombay died unexpectedly. And at this point, I want to talk a little bit about the women in the Sassoon family and also in the Kadoorie family, because I think the story of women in history, but especially in history from the 19th and 20th century, is often forgotten. And it's really fascinating looking at how women fared in these families. So when one of the Sassoon sons died in Bombay, the family was thrown into crisis. They didn't quite know who was going to run things because all the other sons were in London living the life and hanging out with the king and spending money, but not earning it. So at this point, Flora Sassoon, who was the wife of the Sassoon brother who died, basically said she offered to run the family business in Bombay for a few years until her son, who was a teenager, came of age and could kind of resume the male line of succession. And her brothers-in-law in London thought that was fine because they thought, well, she's a woman and she'll be a caretaker. We'll be able to control her. And then, things will go back to the way they should be when her son takes over. As it turned out, Flora Sassoon was a brilliant businesswoman. She was very well educated. She spoke several languages, was extremely well read, and it turned out also had an incredible gift for business. Now, this was at a time when women not only didn't have the vote, they literally couldn't be seen in public in India. They lived behind what was called purdah. And so Flora Sassoon began running this global empire from her living room. But gradually she began to step out more, and it was considered somewhat scandalous, but she began going to the Sassoon offices, visiting the Sassoon factories, putting a public face of a woman in charge of this big company. And in fact, in a time kind of much like what we've been going through ourselves, a bubonic plague came to Bombay. And the Sassoon workers were so terrified about getting sick that they refused to go to work. And this really threatened the stability of the family business. And so Flora reached out and paid for several European scientists to come to Bombay to find a vaccine for the bubonic plague. And they succeeded. And then Flora insisted that she be given the vaccine first. And even more dramatically, that a photograph be taken of her with her sleeve rolled up, getting the shot, so her workers would see that this vaccine was safe and that they should take it. So again, the idea of a wealthy British woman rolling up her sleeve, in public and having a photograph taken as she got a vaccine was shocking to many people in India, but it worked. Her workers trusted the vaccine, they began coming back to work, and the Sassoon fortune in many ways was saved by what Flora did. But all her actions began to make her brothers-in-law very nervous. They realized that this was not a woman who was easily controlled. She wouldn't just be a marionette who would do what they wanted her to do. And so they essentially staged a boardroom coup that kicked her out of the company, and they took complete control again. Flora Sassoon ended up sailing to England. She settled there. She became a very well-known philanthropist and a Jewish scholar, but she never set foot in the Sassoon businesses again. As a friend of mine said, she hit the bamboo ceiling, the point at which, women could not rise. Another woman who's fascinating around this time is Laura Kadoorie. Now, the Kadoories are the other family that I write about in my book. And they were from Baghdad as well. And they had originally worked for the Sassoons. As the Sassoons expanded their empire in China, they needed people they could trust to work with. And so the Sassoons sent word back to Baghdad that if families wanted to send their teenage boys to India, the Sassoons would train them, give them an education, give them an apprenticeship in accounting or other business skills, send them to China, give them a job. But not only that, they were building Jewish hospitals, Jewish synagogues, so that these Jewish employees from Baghdad would be able to, if they got sick, they'd get medical care, they'd get an education, and they built Jewish cemeteries. So in case they died, they would have a Jewish burial. And so many families in Baghdad saw this as a way to kind of bring money home to their families who had fallen on hard times in Baghdad. And so the Kadoorie family had been upper middle class. Their father had died, and they had fallen on hard times. And so Rima Kadoorie decided to send several of her sons to Bombay to work for the Sassoons. Eli Kadoorie was 18 years old when he arrived in China. He was 15 years old when he left Baghdad. So just imagine what it must have been like for a 15-year-old boy to leave Baghdad, leave everything he knew, go to work and be trained in Bombay, and then at 18 found himself in a small town in China. Eli Kadoorie didn't speak Chinese. He had never been to China before, and yet he suddenly realized there was enormous potential to make money in China. It was this kind of gold rush that was going on. And so he quit the Sassoons and began working on his own, making his way down to Hong Kong and investing. And by the time he was 30, he had become a millionaire. And like many, young men, decided it was time to find a wife. So he sailed to London, and in London he met Laura Kadoorie. Laura Mikado was her name. She was from a very prominent Jewish family, a wealthy Jewish family, and the two of them fell in love and they got married. Now, typically at that time, what would have happened was that she would have gotten pregnant. Ellie would have returned to China to make his fortune and develop his business, and he would have come home maybe a couple of times a year to visit his children. But Laura was a very different kind of woman. She had traveled. She was, in fact, older than Ellie, and her family was worried that she was going to become a spinster. But she was very spirited. And after she married Ellie, she announced that she was going to go back to China with him. And so the two of them sailed back to Hong Kong. She quickly gave birth to two boys. And then even more remarkably, she announced that she was going to travel around China with her husband while he did his business deals. And luckily for me, she actually kept a diary. She kept a diary for about 15 years that kind of tracked all the things that she saw, the poverty she saw, the civil war that was tearing China apart, the ways in which Chinese people were suffering. And in many ways, I think she became the conscience of the Kadoorie family. While her husband was off doing all these business deals, Laura concluded that one of the reasons China was suffering so much, why there was so much poverty and so much pain among the Chinese, was that girls didn't have a chance to get an education. She thought girls' education was incredibly important. And so she began to persuade her husband to fund the creation of girls' schools for Chinese girls in China. Now, this was all around 1900. I mean, this was unheard of. No one, not even the Chinese, were building schools for Chinese girls. She also became involved in building schools for girls in Baghdad because she believed that it was important to raise the stature of women in the Middle East as well. And so these schools began to pop up, and Laura Kadoorie became very involved in charity that was designed to give charity to Chinese who were suffering, which again was something that none of the other British wives or families were doing. The Kadoories eventually settled in Shanghai in a beautiful mansion there. And one day a fire broke out, and Laura Kadoorie ran out. But she was convinced that the governess, the Chinese servant she had hired to take care of her two boys, was still trapped inside in the flames. So Laura Kadoorie ran back into the fire, looking for her Chinese servant. As it turned out, the governess had gone out by a different door. Laura got disoriented, she was overcome by the smoke, and she died in the fire. Now, this was obviously a tremendous blow to the Kadoorie family, but it was also something that the Chinese, talked about, and to this day still talk about. This idea that a wealthy British woman would run into a burning building to save a Chinese servant was something that was almost, unbelievable to them, especially at a time when China was being occupied by so many colonial powers. And I think it shows not only her commitment to sort of the real China, but also had an incredible impact on the family and on her sons and on the kind of decisions that they would make in the years to come. Now, the Sassoons at this point were very prominent in England. They were powerful in China. They were spreading across the world. And it's at this point I want to introduce Victor Sassoon. If there's ever a movie that's going to be made about this book, Victor Sassoon is going to be the star. Victor Sassoon was born in Europe, went to Cambridge, and was a charming rogue. He was considered one of the most eligible bachelors and playboys in London when he was growing up. When he was at Cambridge University, he had one of the best wine cellars in Europe. He was always seen with a chorus girl on each arm. He loved going to the races. And everyone thought that Victor Sassoon would be one of the Sassoons who would spend a lot of money, but would never really show much interest in business. But during World War I, he was a fighter pilot, and his plane crashed, and he became crippled. He lost the use of his legs. And he fell into a depression and basically concluded that he would not be able to have the kind of grand social life he had envisioned, that he had so looked forward to, because of his disability. So he decided to go to India and China to see if there was anything in the family business that he might be able to do. And as it turned out, he had a brilliant knack for business. He very quickly decided to move all the Sassoon money out of India and to move it to Shanghai. And he almost single-handedly turned Shanghai into one of the most glamorous cities in the world. He built the Cathay Hotel, the hotel that I went into all those years later to use the restroom, along with many of the other buildings that really define the Shanghai waterfront today. He revolutionized Shanghai and really made it a spot on the grand tour of Europe. You know, these days we're all sort of planning our post-pandemic trips. If this were back in the 1930s, we'd all be planning to go to Shanghai because it was exotic, it was surprising, it was a little bit naughty. And people from all around the world began to go there. Charlie Chaplin would sail to Shanghai to stay at Victor Sassoon's hotel. Noel Coward wrote Private Lives in a suite at the Cathay Hotel. Wallace Simpson, who would a few years later make the King of England leave his throne, was photographed in Shanghai, nude except for a life jacket, which gives you a sense of what Shanghai was like. It was, as I say, it was exotic. It was also dangerous, but also had this sense of the mysterious orient about it. And Victor Sassoon knew how to have a good time. He would have these extravagant parties in his hotel where he would dress up as a ringmaster and all the people had to dress up as circus acts. He would dress up as a schoolmaster and everyone else would dress up as a pupil. It was really just a remarkably heady time. At one point when I was in Shanghai, I went up to see the penthouse suite that Victor Sassoon built for himself, kind of at the top of the hotel overlooking Shanghai, so he could look at his empire. And I was walking around and I went into the bathroom there to see what it was like. And the Chinese fellow next to me looked a little embarrassed because there were two bathtubs in Victor Sassoon's private bathroom. And I said to him, I said, why are there two bathtubs here? And he kind of blushed and he said, well, Victor Sassoon always said he didn't mind sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath. So that gives you a sense of what life was like for Victor Sassoon in Shanghai. But by the late 1930s, different people start coming in on these ships that are docking in Shanghai. Not just Charlie Chaplin and Noel Coward and other celebrities and wealthy people, but Jewish refugees. These are refugees who are fleeing the Nazis. By 1938-39, the Nazis have taken over Germany, they've moved into Austria, and Jews are desperate to get out of Europe. And especially in Vienna and Berlin, there were middle-class Jews who wanted, to just go anywhere that would take them in. But as we know, every country in the world essentially closed their doors and would not accept any more Jewish refugees, except Shanghai. Because Shanghai was occupied by the British, by the Americans, by the Japanese at that point, by the French and by others, it essentially didn't have a functioning government. And what that meant was that if you made it to Shanghai, you would be safe. So as word of this spread, especially in Vienna and Berlin, middle-class Jews, doctors, lawyers, merchants, musicians, professors, began to sell their belongings for whatever they could to book passage on these cruise ships that would take them to Shanghai. And ultimately, 18,000 of them made their way to Shanghai. And again, just to imagine what that was like, here are these Jews who at one moment are living in Vienna, they're living in Berlin, they're dressed up in their German clothes, and they suddenly arrive in Shanghai on these ships where no one speaks English or German. They don't speak Chinese. There's incredible poverty that people are literally dying in the streets. As these Jews came in, it was a terrifying prospect for them, but a real dilemma for Victor Sassoon and the Kadoorie family. What were they going to do with these Jewish refugees? And much to their credit, both families stepped up and they began to Victor Sassoon turned several of his buildings into dormitories for these refugees. He hired many of them. The Kadoories set up a school for the refugee children, which included, as it turned out, people like Michael Blumenthal, who was became U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Lawrence Tribe, the Harvard professor, Peter Max, who many of us remember from the 1960s with his posters. These were all children of the refugees who ended up going to the Kadoories school that gave them some stability and some education during the war. But Victor Sassoon not only was trying to help these refugees financially, he also began negotiating with the Japanese, trying to persuade them as they encircled Shanghai not to shut the gates. The Japanese were allies of the Germans. They had invaded China, they had conquered parts of it, and they had encircled Shanghai, but didn't want to conquer it because they were afraid that would prompt the US and Britain to go to war against them. This was before Pearl Harbor. And so the Japanese appointed a colonel, an anti-Semitic colonel, who was in charge of the Jewish question in Shanghai. And Victor Sassoon met with him, and he was a charming man. And so Victor Sassoon said to this anti-Semitic Japanese colonel, "You're welcome to stay at my hotel, come to my nightclub, your officers are welcome." At the same time, he was having his waiters and bartenders spy on the Japanese officers and report back on what they were saying. He himself flew to South America, tried to buy land where the Jews might be able to find some safety. But his main goal was to keep Shanghai open. So these thousands of Jews who were arriving every month would still be able to find refuge. And he pulled it off. And in fact, he pulled it off so successfully that even when the Germans sent members of the Gestapo to Shanghai to meet with the Japanese, and they said to the Japanese, "Look, you've got these Jewish refugees, you have a Jewish problem. Here's what you should do. You should gather all the Jews up, put them on barges, and sink the barges in the middle of the river, and that will take care of your Jewish problem." And the Japanese were appalled by this, but they also had been persuaded in part by Victor Sassoon that it was a good idea to sort of, keep these Jews maybe as hostages. Maybe they would have influence in being able to keep, other countries out of the war. It was almost like a con game that Victor Sassoon was pulling on the Japanese. Eventually, the Japanese caught on, and Victor Sassoon had to flee Shanghai. The Kadoories were not so lucky. They stayed in Hong Kong and Shanghai too long. And after Pearl Harbor, they were arrested by the Japanese, put in prison camps. And Eli Kadoorie, the patriarch of the family, died while he was under Japanese internment. After the war, Victor Sassoon returned to Shanghai. He thought the parties would resume. He thought life would return to normal. But of course, it didn't. Within a few years, the communists had surrounded Shanghai. They conquered Shanghai. Victor Sassoon fled. He got a round-trip ticket from Shanghai, but he never returned. He lived the rest of his life in a kind of exile in the Bahamas and became quite bitter about Shanghai. He once said, "I didn't leave China, China left me," almost like a spurned lover. The Kadoories, by contrast, decided to go to Hong Kong. And Hong Kong was a British colony. And there the Kadoories decided to try to rebuild their fortune. The Sassoons lost almost everything in Shanghai because most of their money was in property and so forth. The Kadoories had moved some of their money to Hong Kong, and they were able to be really the driving force behind Hong Kong's resurgence in the 50s, 60s, and 70s as it became a tremendously successful colony of Britain. Today, the Kadoories are still in Hong Kong, even under Chinese rule. They are the richest Western family in China. They're worth about $13 billion. And I think, like a lot of Westerners now, they're wondering what will happen to Hong Kong, what will happen to China as history kind of swerves again. I can talk more about that, but why don't I stop?
I don't know about yours, but I think that actually right on cue, he froze. So he'll be back. I will let him in and we'll get to Q&A. So while we have this brief hiatus, think about what questions you would like to ask, and we'll see if we can get Jonathan back in. Okay, hold on for 1 second. Well, I expect he'll be with us shortly, but if he's going to break down, that was the perfect time to break. So I have a bunch of questions that I've been getting from you guys. I have to say, I have actually visited, I don't know if you have visited India. I've been to India, I've been to Bombay, I've been to Hong Kong. I've not been to Shanghai. We've done programs about the Sassoons and Kadoories, but this is the clearest articulation of the history of the families I have ever heard, and really puts everything to perspective. So I'm glad we got the program in before we lost Jonathan. He will be back because this happened right when we were about to start the program. That's why we were a little late. Let's see if Jonathan is here. Oh. Hey, Jonathan, are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. You disappeared on us, right? I mean, it was perfect plan. At least it was right at the end of the program.
My apologies.
We can't see you, though. Would you turn on your camera?
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to do this from my phone, so it's
okay. We have patience. Beverly's relaxing over there in St. Louis. She's going to stay.
There we go.
Okay. So yeah, if you're going to break down, I think right when you hit the landing was the good time to do it. You hit the landing. So here's some questions that are coming in. Well, first of all of you, so I've texted you the name of the book. You can get it on Amazon or any other book purchaser you like to use. I'll follow up this lecture with a link to the program so you can watch it and share it, as well as a link to how to purchase this book. And on CSP, our YouTube channel, we've got many programs you can watch. So I think that answers some of your questions. I guess my question is, why do you think the Sassoon family and the Kadoories, but particularly Sassoons, were so successful? What was unique about them that you found?
I think in a way, the fact that they were outsiders as Jews really contributed to their success. A lot of the British, there was a lot of anti-Semitism in Shanghai and in Hong Kong. It was social anti-Semitism. The Jews, they couldn't join clubs and so forth. And because they weren't part of that kind of network, that old boy network that was so important in Britain, they had to be more entrepreneurial. Whether it was in selling opium or other investments, they worked, frankly, with the Chinese more than the British did. They worked with other immigrants. And so I think it's often the story of Jewish history, which is that what starts out as kind of something that's hard. In other words, you're not allowed into certain clubs, you're not allowed into certain businesses, becomes an asset because you're looking and finding other ways to advance. And so I think that entrepreneurial drive, that desire to succeed, was very strong in both families.
People have asked questions about your research and where you went for your research and who you spoke to. Did you have, what kind of challenges did you have in doing the research? And did you talk to contemporary Kadoories, for example?
Yeah, I did. Both families were extremely helpful and willing to talk. The Sassoons are fairly well known in Britain. The book just came out in Britain, and the Sassoons are, a little bit like the Rockefellers in that people know about them. The Kadoories were more private, but they had an incredible archive. It's sort of like, we all try to organize our pictures and our memoirs, but when you have $13 billion, you can really do it the right way. They had an archive with a professional archivist, which they opened up to me. But the families, because they were such global families, the papers and the family members themselves were scattered kind of all around the world. I mean, it's interesting. As I mentioned, Victor Sassoon, the playboy, settled in the Bahamas, and he ended up marrying his nurse. He never married in China, but when he was 65, he married his nurse in the Bahamas. She was from Dallas, Texas. So when Victor Sassoon died and when she died, his papers ended up going to Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And so I went down there to look through them. And I was going through his kind of business diary, which was a list of every day he made a list of all the businessmen he was meeting with and so forth. And when I was going through these kind of yellowed pages, suddenly these pictures of naked women started dropping out. And I was a little embarrassed, thinking the librarian was going to come over and kick me out or something. And I realized that one of the ways in which Victor Sassoon met women in Shanghai was he was an amateur photographer and he had a studio. And so he would go down to these ships that were, bringing all these celebrities and wealthy women to China. And he would offer to take their photograph. And he would bring them back to his studio and then seduce them. And so here were these pictures of all these kind of naked women. And what was interesting was a number of them were women from India and women from China. In a bizarre way, it gave me an insight not only into what it was like to be Victor Sassoon and a rich playboy, but the fact that he was breaking some of the social barriers, inviting Chinese women and others into his hotel and having affairs and so forth. So some of the research like that could be pretty interesting in unexpected ways.
How well are the Kadoories and the Sassoons remembered in China right now? Are they names that are spoken about, talked about in many circles, or are they forgotten names?
No, they're very well known, actually. And in fact, it's interesting. I think that the book is coming out is going to be translated and will be coming out in China, which surprised me given the state of U.S.-China relations. I wasn't sure that would happen. But I think that's a sign that this history is fascinating to the Chinese as well. I've been going back and forth to Shanghai for decades now. And one of the things that's interesting is that now there are Chinese tourists who go to the Cathay Hotel. It's now called the Peace Hotel. They want to know this story, especially in Shanghai, because it explains why Shanghai feels so different. Anyone who's been to China or read about it, Shanghai and Hong Kong feel very different. And that's because of the legacy of these very cosmopolitan families. And I think the Chinese want to know about that. The Kadoories also, I think, and in general, when you go to China, it's one of the few places in the world these days where if you say you're Jewish, it doesn't prompt a series of awkward conversations. The Jews are really well thought of in China. The Chinese are fascinated by the Jews. They think we're good at business, but they also, I think, feel that there's a connection between the kind of reliance on education, on families, and a long history that Jews and Chinese share. And of course, they're very proud of the fact that they were a refuge for so many refugees during World War II. So as part of that, I think there is a fascination and interest in both these families even today.
Follow-up question to the Jews who were able to find safe haven in Shanghai. How did they get out when they needed to get out? There was 18,000 of them.
Well, these Jews had never planned to go to China, right? It was just the one place that would let them in, and so they got there. And then, as soon as the Americans liberated Shanghai, they realized that the Jews had been completely cut off. They really didn't have much news about what was going on in Europe. Most of the refugees anticipated they would go back to Vienna, back to Berlin, back to the lives that had been uprooted by the war. But there are these heartbreaking photographs of the American soldiers putting up lists on store windows of all the towns in Europe that had been destroyed and wiped out, of families that had been destroyed in Berlin and Vienna. And the refugees are gathered around and thvery realizing there's no home to go back to. That as hard as life was in Shanghai, there wasn't enough food, housing was very crowded. There was nothing for them to return to. And so most of them ended up going to, some to Palestine, some to Australia, South America, and to the United States. They basically became another part of the diaspora. It's interesting, the Kadoories did a great deal to help resettle the refugees, to get them out of China to Hong Kong and then on ships that would take them elsewhere. But the Kadoories vowed that they would never invest more than half their money in China. And so as these refugees were leaving, the Kadoories would go around and give many of them brown paper envelopes stuffed with cash and say, when you get to Australia, will you buy some properties in our name so we can begin to spread our investments to protect ourselves in case, China has, or Hong Kong is invaded by China. And so it became another way in which the Kadoories were able to expand their businesses worldwide.
Barbara asked, did the Kadoorie and Sassoon families intermarry and assimilate, or did they kind of stay within the Jewish world and their own communities?
The Sassoons assimilated more. As I said, when they went to Britain, they kind of dove in to British society, sending their kids to Eton and universities and so forth. And as we know from many of our own experiences, when Jews become part of secular society, they often drift away from Judaism. And that was true for many of the Sassoons. Some of them even converted. And it's interesting when you look at the wills that the Sassoons had to file in London. The grandparent, the older Sassoons who had left Baghdad, who had left India, are thundering in their wills that their children must marry other Jews. But of course, very often they didn't. And I would say today, the Sassoons in England are much more, they consider themselves, of Jewish heritage, but they're not very religious. By contrast, the Kadoories actually were Zionists. The Sassoons were accepted very early by Britain, but the Kadoories were never accepted fully. They kept on trying to become British citizens. The British wouldn't let them. The British kept on making all these comments about, allowing too many of those kinds of people into Britain. And so early on, the Kadoories became Zionists. And I think they identify more. They're probably what we would consider Reform Jews today. They go for the high holidays, they go to services, they support the synagogue. In some ways, they remind me of sort of, Michael Bloomberg or, Jewish executives on Wall Street or in Hollywood, where they're Jewish, but it's not, they're certainly not as religious as they were when they left Baghdad. A couple of the Sassoons did go to Jerusalem and have become fairly observant there and have become rabbis. But both families really are much more secular these days.
Did either of the families make it to the United States and make it big here at all?
No, they did not. They remained really British, and they certainly had the ability to. And the Kadoories have, real estate, and they own the Peninsula Hotel chain. I mean, they have business interests in the United States. But again, they've stayed in Hong Kong, which is so interesting. Certainly financially, they could live anywhere. And the fact that they stayed in Hong Kong and became really very close to the Chinese government. They were involved in the negotiations when Hong Kong was handed over to Britain. They meet regularly with top Chinese officials, including Xi Jinping, the president of China. But I think, like a lot of Westerners now, they're nervous about the future, and they're kind of walking this tightrope where they have incredible business interests and, family interest and memories of China. But China, as it becomes more nationalistic, can be a scary place for them.
The beautiful synagogue in Hong Kong that's still there. Was that built by the Kadoories or the Sassoons?
It was actually built by the Sassoons, but is maintained by the Kadoories. And the Kadoories are the biggest supporters of the Jewish community. Most of the Jewish community in Hong Kong now are expatriates, Americans, Israelis, and others. But the synagogue is beautiful, and there are 5 synagogues in Shanghai, a couple of which are open, one of which has been turned into a really remarkably good museum on the Jewish refugees in Shanghai, and it's definitely worth visiting
when we can travel again. Did the Kadoories or Sassoons have any inroads in other major or minor Chinese cities?
Yes, well, they ended up going to a number of sort of minor cities, but Shanghai was sort of the business hub of China. It was sort of like New York or Los Angeles. It was the main place where businessmen wanted to settle, and it was also the most comfortable place for Westerners. I mean, one of the interesting things about both families is that they lived, they were part of Chinese history. They stood astride Chinese history and politics for 175 years. None of them ever bothered to learn Chinese, which, may tell you all you need to know about imperialism and colonialism. And so essentially Shanghai was a place where you could, you could live like that there were servants and there were business associates who, spoke English and could sort of you could understand China through them.
Leora and many other people have asked, are these families covered in some kind of documentary or a movie, or is there something in the works that you are involved in that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, the book has been optioned to be a movie or a TV series. You never know. It's like a very long process for that. If you're interested in the refugee story, there's a very good PBS documentary that ran about a year and a half ago, I think, called Harbor from the Holocaust. And it's a PBS documentary. I'm sure you can find it online, Harbor from the Holocaust, which is about the refugee crisis from the Chinese point of view. It's a Chinese filmmaker who's based in the US now, who found Chinese families who talk about what it was like when these refugees arrived. And it's actually quite touching, because one of the things you see is that, ordinary Chinese, these Jewish refugees showed up, out of nowhere. And one of the things the Jewish refugees talked about was how nice the Chinese were to them. Even though the Chinese themselves were very poor, were being oppressed by the Japanese, were suffering, they would share food. They would take their children for rickshaw rides. And so in this documentary, you hear Chinese families talking about that. And it's kind of a very nice human story of these two groups during World War II that kind of, find each other.
As I mentioned, I have been to Hong Kong, and I've been to the synagogue you mentioned the beautiful synagogue in Hong Kong. But I have not been to Shanghai, and there's a question, are there synagogues still left in Shanghai? And what's Jewish life like there right now?
Well, the Jewish life is really, again, it's expatriates. And in fact, the Chinese are quite nervous about religion. And so they don't want any sort of organized the history is fine. They don't want any organized Jewish religion, certainly among the Chinese. But what is interesting is that this area where most of the Jews left, where I saw the mezuzahs on the tenement doorposts, has been turned into, I don't want to say a kind of Jewish Disneyland, but it has been turned into a kind of a historical site where you can go around and see where the Jews lived. It was actually called Little Vienna because there were so many Jews from Europe who were settling there. Benjamin Netanyahu would often visit. And it has this really quite good museum that talks about Jewish life and talks about the way in which, they call it the Shanghai ghetto, but it was not a ghetto like Poland or these other countries in Europe. It was a place where Jews were able to, get married. Several Jews studied to be rabbis. There were, many concerts and so forth. Conditions were hard. There's no question about that. But it's one of the miracles of World War II that even under the pressure of the Nazis, no Jews were killed in Shanghai and 18,000 survived. And so you can see that story. It's called the Shanghai Refugee Museum, and it's worth looking at.
Rita asks, she says the title of your book was about the rivalry between the families, the Kadoories and Sassoons. So what was the rivalry?
The rivalry was, the Sassoons, as I said, were the pioneers. And they became, Victor Sassoon was probably the sixth richest man in the world in the 1930s. The Kadoories started out working for the Sassoons. And so Elie Kadoorie, when he broke away as a young man, I still think the Sassoons looked upon him as sort of the poor relation. They were the big conglomerate. They were the kind of the ones who had, the ear of the Prince of Wales and so forth. And the Kadoories were always strivers. And so I think there was always a kind of a rivalry there. It's interesting, when the refugees began arriving, Victor Sassoon was not a religious man. I often joke that he was much more likely to give money to a synagogue than ever set foot in one. But as these refugees started arriving, Elie Kadoorie confronted him, went to the Cafe Hotel to meet with him. And he said, look, Victor, you're a playboy. I know you don't care about these things, but this is a crisis for our people, and you need to step up. And to his credit, Victor Sassoon did. And so I think there was always a sense that the Kadoories had that they were kind of one step behind the Sassoons. But what's interesting is that when the Sassoons lost everything when the communists took over, the Kadoories, by staying in Hong Kong, essentially were able to surpass the Sassoons. And when they returned to China in the 1970s, they were richer than ever and much richer than the Sassoons. So I think part of the rivalry was this sense of kind of the people who started out as the employees, as the staff, kind of end up making decisions which vault them ahead of the Sassoons.
Interesting. We have time just for a few more questions. Rabbi Marty Lawson asked the question, I don't know if this is true or not, but he wants to know, how did the Kadoorie family come to build a synagogue in Porto, in Portugal? Is that something you...
Yeah, the Kadoorie name is actually not an uncommon one. And so there were various branches of the family or other namesakes. I assume it was part of the diaspora of these. I mean, the Baghdadi Jews, we think of now as the Iraqi Jews. There's quite a large community of Iraqi Jews around Los Angeles. They always saw themselves as the Jewish aristocracy. When you talk to Iraqi Jews, I've done talks in Montreal and elsewhere where there are large groups of Iraqi Jews. And, they say we're the best Jewish business people, we're the smartest ones. And so I think what you saw were Iraqi Jews, including probably some members of the Kadoorie clan, settling in these different places and then building synagogues and other institutions.
So I assume you talked about how you kind of started this research, what prompted you to. And I assume you read other people's books. I mean, I assume there are other books written about the two families, but this is not the first book.
Well, actually, no, nothing's ever been written about the Kadoories. They've never been written about. And the last book about the Sassoons came out, in like 1960 or so. It was a very early book. There is actually quite a nice book, if you want to know more about the glamour of Shanghai, called Grand Hotel, I think, or Hotel Grand, by someone who looks at kind of Victor Sassoon and his life at the hotel. But surprisingly, not that much had been written about these families or about the role that they and other Jews played in the development of China.
Charles asked, you have quite a few people that have read your book, which is great, and now they're asking specific questions. So in our last minutes, I'll give them the opportunity to get answers to their questions. Charles says that you mentioned in your book about letters between the Sassoon brothers in Judeo-Arabic that are located at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and that you worked with Dr. Yaron Ben Naed translating. What did you find most interesting in those, and will they be published, I guess, are the two questions.
Right. Well, a couple of things are interesting about that. So, everybody was arriving in Shanghai in the 19th century seeking their fortune. And again, people communicated by telegraph or by letter, but there was an incredible amount of what we would today call industrial espionage. They were all trying to spy on each other and find out what deals were being done. So the Sassoons had an advantage because all their employees were Jews from Baghdad. And Jews in Baghdad speak this dialect of Judeo-Arabic, which is essentially Arabic written with Hebrew letters. And what that meant was they sort of had a built-in code that was enabled them to sort of communicate with each other and overseas, and nobody could break it. It's hard for me because only about 12 people in the world these days know how to read Judeo-Arabic. So I went to Jerusalem and was trying to figure out what to do. And so there's a professor there who does speak Judeo-Arabic. And we literally sat in his living room for several days while he picked out letters and kind of, read the juicy parts to me. What was interesting was how quickly the Sassoons figured out how the system worked. Right here they were from Baghdad. They were living in Bombay. It was the first time they'd ever been in London. And yet very quickly they're writing to their father in Bombay saying, well, we're going to have a big party. We're going to invite the Prince of Wales. We're going to invite these British aristocrats. Their father writes back saying, make sure the newspapers cover this. It'll be good publicity for us. They sort of understood the interplay of kind of politics and business from a very early stage. And the letters, there were thousands of them, are very businesslike. But you see over time, it changes from discussions of the price of opium and trade to this kind of social world and the way in which the Sassoons get seduced and very successfully maneuver through the kind of British society. It was remarkable to me that, essentially these immigrants figured out so quickly how the world worked.
Charles also asks, by the way, another question about the Gubais. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Gubbays, the Gubai family. I wanted to know if there are any resources to read about them and what.
Yeah, they're a well-known family in Hong Kong. The Kadoories actually intermarry with them. If you do a Google search, some of these names will pop up, and there's like, the Encyclopedia Judaica. There are a couple of books on prominent Jews of China that talks about them. And a Google search, if you go down a few levels, you can probably find out some more.
I see Ellen and some other people have written that their families were part of the Shanghai Jews. I mean, they survived. She was born there in 1947. So her story is the story that you were talking about. Oh my gosh. People are asking about different Sassoons that they know and whether they're related. I mean, if we see a Sassoon in the United States, is that going to be a relation, or is the Sassoon name, a name that's been adopted?
The Sassoon name is pretty common. I mean, you should always ask, but I think that it's far more likely in Britain because that's where most of the family stayed. But it's interesting because now with the book coming out, I've gotten members of the Sassoon family calling me saying, these were things we didn't even know, because the history you hear over the kitchen table from your family, as we know, is not often the real history. There are a lot of Sassoons out there, but the ones who are really influential and wealthy are mostly in Britain these days.
Rita, one of our patrons, asks, did the Kadoories and the Sassoons actually ever work together, or were they just really in competition most of the time?
No, they worked together. They did many investments together when they were investing in things like the gas company in Shanghai and things like that. Because they were the two kind of biggest investors, the two wealthiest families, they often worked together. And again, I think that was one reason why they were able to succeed, is because they were able to think outside the box, and they brought in Chinese partners and others that really allowed them to vault ahead. And as a result, had an incredible impact on the Chinese. I mean, one thing that's really striking is how many Chinese businessmen, got a kind of training by working with the Sassoons and the Kadoories.
Uh-oh. I think we lost Jonathan. We got a lot of stuff, though, I have to say. I think that I may, if he comes back, I was going to ask him Jennifer's question, which is, what is the new project? You can see why Jonathan won the Pulitzer Prize, by the way. Well, actually, maybe you can't. I think writing is different than speaking. He obviously can write, but look, we've done 281 programs, and he is definitely one of the most organized, eloquent speakers we've had. We're going to have him back. One of his specialties I know he's working on now is Black-Jewish relations in America. So we'll be doing a program on that in the next month or so. I will see if he's available to bring back in, and if not, I will wrap it up. So hold on. Maybe, I don't know, maybe the Tampa Bay team is like blocking our transmission today as the Red Sox are playing. But I don't see him back in here. Okay, well, I think given that we're basically done, I'm going to call it a done deal, but I will in the follow-up tell you what the newest book is that he's working on. If people, Amalia asked, how do you access the recording to this after this? Well, first of all, you can go to occsp.net, and there's a button that connects to our YouTube channel. So you can go to our YouTube channel, you can subscribe, you'll get this program and many other programs that you can watch. But I also follow up in the next day or two once this recording is cleaned up. I'll upload it to our YouTube channel, and I'll share it in an email to all of you. So you'll get the YouTube recording of this entire program. You will also get a lot of follow-up material and follow-up reading. It is an excellent book and really interesting and very contemporary as to what's going on in China and Hong Kong. So I urge you all to read the book, and we'll have Jonathan back. Hopefully he is doing okay in Boston. If you're in Boston, hopefully you haven't had a shutdown of your electricity or something weird going on. I'll call my parents and I'll find out if they're okay. I would like to thank Marcia Novak, who I see there, for recommending Jonathan as a speaker. Marcia, he was excellent. I want to thank my parents. I think Aubrey and Rolene were on the program. You didn't see them, but they were there. I also wanted to thank Phyllis Schwartz for recommending the speaker. And I guess I hope to see you all this week. We got some great programs. Take care. And if you're new to CSP, come more often. OCCSP.net, join us. Harris and Jan, my neighbors, will tell you that we do great programs. And when we're allowed to travel, we do excellent adventures. We were supposed to be in Israel in October, but we decided it wasn't going to happen this year. We push it off for 1 year, and we will get back to Israel. But I think we are working on a trip to Jewish Boston in June. We'll take a small group and learn about the history of Jewish Boston in a CSP fashion, which means a lot of history and a lot of contemporary stuff and going to places, even though I guarantee that if you lived in Boston your whole life, you will learn things you didn't know about Jewish history of Boston. So I will keep you all informed about that. And go Red Sox. Take care, everybody. Be safe.